we're recording. It's July 1954 and the Vancouver Commonwealth Games are about to kick off. Earlier that year, Mike Agostini broke a very long-standing world record for the 100 yards indoors, and a couple of months later, Hector Hogan from Queensland, Australia, equalled a world outdoor 100 yards record, 100 metres I think it was, both, all right, on the same day at Sydney Sports Ground, I believe, on grass. And at that point, back in March of 1954, the men's 100 yards at the Commonwealth Games in Vancouver was looking like the singular glamour event of the entire Games, all sports. Of course, the middle distance runners conspired to foil that, and on the 6th of May, 1954, at Iffley Road in Oxford, Roger Bannister, a young medical student, became the first man to run the mile in under 4 minutes, 3:59.4. And not long after that, Australia's John Landy broke that world record, and so the two of them, both from Commonwealth nations, were the only two men in history to have broken 4 minutes for the mile, and therefore the Commonwealth Games of 54 was built round the Miracle Mile. And to some extent, the men's 100 yards was certainly overshadowed, perhaps justifiably, but nevertheless there were two great athletes in that race, at least two great athletes, and one of them was Mike Agostini, who we're interviewing today at the 60 years on from his gold medal run to win the Commonwealth Games in 54 in Vancouver, and Mike is in Sydney, Australia. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us, Mike.
My pleasure.
Can you just give us a little bit of a scene setter? The world record had stood for, 30 years or so at the world indoor record for 100 yards?
9.8 seconds.
9.8. And you ran 9.6.
Yep.
But it was on, what was the surface?
A board track.
A board track.
175th Street Armory in Washington, D.C. A wooden track.
Yep.
No spikes, flat shoes. But it was a pretty good field. Included in the field was Lindy Remigino, the reigning Olympic 100 meters champion, and Art Bragg, the reigning American 100 yards champion. And that was my second major race in America. I had just gone to Villanova University.
But you were born in Trinidad.
Yep.
And this world record run came on your 19th birthday.
That's right, and the Trinidad paper, as all of us media people do, they said 19th birthday promise to mum and dad. But we had three events: 60 yards, 80 yards, and 100 yards, and I won two of the three of those. And I didn't go out expecting, I didn't even know what the world record was, but everything went pretty wild, and up came a world record, and the next thing I know, I was being called the new world's fastest human. And then not only that, the head of the Jamaican Olympic Committee and Association, the late Sir Herbert MacDonald, shouted me at dinner afterwards and gave me $20 US in cash. And I didn't know whether to take it, because as an amateur you can't take money. But Sir Herbert would have known better.
Of course. Michael, there would have been quite a little bit of banter at that stage about Hec Hogan, certainly when he set world records in the 100 metres and 100 yards on the same afternoon at the Sydney Sports Ground.
That's a few months later.
Was it March of 54?
Heck wasn't known. I mean, he was known. He had beaten John Treloar, the reigning Australian champion,
And a 52
in
Olympic
52,
finalist.
and 48 Olympic finalists, 48 and 52 Treloar. And Hogan won the nationals in 52, but wasn't sent to Helsinki because Treloar was the reigning champion and the double Olympic finalist. So Hogan was, a promising youngish runner, but he certainly wasn't sent to it, and he wasn't known on the world circuit yet in world athletics until he ran 9.3 in one race, and then he ran a 10.2 that couldn't be recognized because it was a handicap race the same day.
Okay, so in 54, I believe the world 100 metres record was still 10.2.
Yes.
And there would be 9 men sharing at one stage the world record, hand-timed 10.2 seconds.
Even after 54, because it was quite a few years until someone ran 10.1, which would have been somewhere around, 2 years anyhow, 1956, and I think that was Ira Murchison, among others.
Yeah, Ira Murchison had run a 10.2. Bobby Morrow, who would go on to win the 56 Olympic 100 metres and 200 metres in Melbourne.
Dave Sim.
He was a 10.2 runner. There were quite a few. McDonald Bailey, Heinz Futterer, Harrison Dillard, Barney Ewell, Hal Davis, Lloyd LeBeach, and Jesse Owens.
Yep.
You knew Jesse Owens, didn't you?
Yes, I entertained Jesse when he was out here for the Caltech Sportsman of the Year Award, and we spent an afternoon in the Hilton Hotel. I was drinking beer and he was drinking bourbon and smoking cigarettes.
Which ultimately caught up with him.
It did. He died of lung cancer.
No, he was a beautiful person, though.
Wonderful man.
Michael, in 1953, it was 1956 before the world record was taken down to 10.1 for the 100 metres. And that was, as you said, Ira Murchison, an American, in Berlin on the 4th of August 1952. Murchison was 5'2" tall.
Yeah.
157 centimetres. And a day earlier, Willie Williams actually became the first 10.1 runner.
Yeah.
Both of them were in Berlin for the International Military Games.
That's right.
So,
I knew them both. I ran against them both.
But 3 years earlier, in 1953, you actually ran a 9.9 for the 100 metres. Can you give us the background to that? And why was that not ratified as a world record?
Well, Mike, firstly, I was running against Herb McKinley, a lot of the great 1952 Olympic champions or medalists, and I'd been to Jamaica and I'd run against them, and they were then brought out to Trinidad to run against me, and I ran against them. After they left, there was one more meeting in Trinidad, and I ran 100 metres and won by quite a few metres, and the officials came out on the track with handkerchiefs waving in the wind, and when I asked, what's that about, they said, man, we ain't got no wind gauge, and the time you run isn't going to be believed. Little unknown boy from Trinidad. And it was the times were 9.9, 9.9, and 10 flat. The fastest unofficial time was 9.7, and the slowest was 10.1.
And this was on a grass track?
On a grass track.
Where at Queen's Park?
Queen's Park Oval, yeah.
Is that Port of Spain? Or?
Yeah, Port of Spain.
Yeah. In 1950, you did have a lot of trouble with officialdom and wind gauges and such forth.
I had that throughout but Mike, I never worried about it because I've always been and still am optimistic. If I wasn't turning 80 and didn't have arthritis and all that, I still think I could go out and break the world record. That's what sprinters have to be like. You're scared in the background, but you're also, on the other hand, optimistic and arrogant almost. I'm going to do this. The story of Hector Hogan, which you may know, but the average person wouldn't know. Mal Whitfield, who was the Olympic 800-meter champion from the U.S. in 48 and 52, was one of my mentors. And Mal said, man, you get out there and just tell them what you're going to do. And if you don't do it, you're going to make a fool of yourself. And you don't want to make a fool of yourself. So I got to Vancouver, and the media met me, and they said, what have you come here to do? And I said, I've come for the gold medal. And they said, what about Hogan? And I said, who the heck is Hogan? And Heck took the bait. The following day, there was an interview with Hogan, and he said, that's the tonic that I need. Agostini's carrying on like that. I'll whip the pants off him. So I kept this going the whole way through on what I'd been taught by Whitfield and also Andy Stanfield, who was the Olympic 200 champion. And when we got to the final, I didn't speak to him even before that. We got to the final, and I gave a big smile, stuck out a hand, and I said, no hard feelings, Heck, let the best man win. And he just went to water. He finished third. That's part of the game.
Well, he also finished third in the 56 Olympic final in the 100 metres, which makes him the only Australian male ever to win an Olympic 100 metre medal.
That's right. Yeah. Look, God bless him, because the only time Heck ever beat me was in the Olympic final. In fact, I stayed on in Australia because I didn't have to go back to uni until February. And I went to Melbourne, ran against Heck, and beat him running 9.4 from coming from behind. And 4 years later, on the day of the Olympic
100 yards.
final, 100 yards, rather. 4 years later, on the day of the Olympic final in Rome, we got the message Heck had died of leukemia. And all I could say is, God bless you, man, you deserve that. But
yeah, he's and so many young Australians today have never heard of Heck Hogan.
I know, it's tragic.
It's tragic. They haven't heard of Peter Norman, our other Olympic.
I ran against Norman.
Short sprints medalist at over 200 metres.
Yeah.
In 1956, you ran 20.1 for 200 metres.
220 yards.
220 yards.
That's worth 19.9 for 200 metres.
Yeah, that's a hell of a run. In Bakersfield, the hottest place on earth, I think.
On not a dirt track, but a clay track.
Clay, yeah.
And you know what? I was just like Jesse Owens on that day in this way. You may not know that on the day that Jesse equaled or broke 5 world records.
6.
6, yeah, that's right. He went to his coach and said, man, coach, I don't feel good. My legs are pain. And the coach said, Jess, just my back, just get out there and do what you can. And Jess ran the 100, 9.4, and came back and said, man, coach, I can't do any more. And before each event, the same thing. Well, I had been feeling ill that morning and didn't even want to go to Bakersfield. And my coach said, come on, Agostini, you're going.
And who was your coach?
Flint Hanna. He was an American javelin champion and Olympian in 1920.
But you had a good association with Dutch Warmerdam, I think, as well.
Well, Dutch was the assistant coach. He was, in fact, the coach. Dutch was the most outstanding type person you can imagine. In fact, he, much like John Landy, much like Herb Elliott, very unassuming, very almost self-effacing, but still confident people. Dutch jumped 15 feet, the first man to jump 15 feet.
Pole vault.
Pole vault, and did it, I think it was 29 times before anybody else ever did it. The first person to do it after Dutch was Bob Richards, the
Reverend
Bob Richards.
Yep. Who won in Melbourne.
He won in Melbourne,
the Olympics, yeah. Michael, what was training like in those days? Did you do short to long or long to short type training? Did you do weightlifting? Did you do plyometrics?
Michael, I am reminded somewhat of the guy who in the Olympics in 1908, I think it was, ran the sprints and the marathon. And someone asked him, how do you train for those? And he said, well, on one day I run short sprints very quickly. And the next day I run long distances very slowly. The
first concurrent or
the only one
design of a program.
The only one I've ever heard of. And he actually finished the marathon. But we trained, Mike, I trained hard. now I wonder, I'm amazed to live to be nearly 80 as I am now, because that level of training has had deleterious effects upon a hell of a lot of people as they get older. And there's more and more research coming out about that, just like there is in football of all kinds with a concussion. But in Trinidad, my father always wanted me to do something exceptional, but I was just a wild kid having fun. And I said, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll become your racehorse. I'll just train, eat, sleep, and compete. And he agreed. And in the mornings, I'd run around the Queen's Park Savannah, which is 2.25 miles around, and I'd jog around that once or twice. I'd sleep until lunchtime, and then I'd get up and I'd run up the hill outside the road where my parents lived, and the whole family lived. And that was a very steep hill, and I'd do 8 or 10 reps of that, 60 or 70 yards. And I was accompanied by the family dog, but he had the good sense and would only do the one at the start and maybe one in the middle and maybe one towards the end. And then in the evenings, once my father came home from work, and they usually finished work then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd borrow his car and I'd drive over the hills and go to one of the beaches and run in the surf, up to knee-high in the surf, to get the knee lift. So it was hard training. But not again to the extent that they seem to do today. I think they do a hell of a lot more today. You'd know more about that. Now, look, we trained hard. I had a very helpful coach. He was a 440 yards, 800 yards runner. He was actually a prison guard, and he had finished in the finals of the Central American and Caribbean Games. And he believed in the same thing about pushing yourself further and further. But I concentrated on two things in particular. The first one was relaxation. That was Mal Whitfield who taught me that. The second one was in doing repetition work over and over again. But I also used to train running against 3 guys over anything from 150 to 300 yards. And it was hard work.
You also did weight training, and you were maybe the only guy around that time that was seriously doing lifting.
I was the only one. Weight training was said to be harmful to athletes. It makes them muscle-bound and slow. And no one advocated weight training. So I got myself, or my father got me, a railway sleeper weighing about 60, 70 or 80 pounds, and I'd do my weight training with that, including squats and squat jumps and everything else, and they seemed to help. But I repeat, everyone said, don't lift weights.
But in 56, we first were introduced to, seriously, in a public way, to Parry O'Brien, who was one of the great pioneers of shot put, started with his back to the front of the circle.
You know how that happened?
Shifted across the disc.
Parry was at USC, and he went into a voluntary lecture that he, on his part, in physics, and he heard the lecturer saying that the longer a force is applied to an object, the greater the power likely to be exerted on that force, and that's when he thought about turning with your back towards the line where you'd put, because up until then, what they did was they hopped. It's just like the Fosbury flop. Today, everybody does something like the Fosbury. No one thought it would happen. I had something in mind, but I never got around to it, and I still believe it can work, and that is doing double steps in the first few steps out of the blocks. But I had no one to encourage me or to advise me. Because if you think about it, getting out of the blocks is the most important thing you have in a race, to get out there. And if you do the double step, you get yourself moving much more quickly. So anyone listening to this wants to try it out, give me some credit, even in my dotage.
So you're talking about short steps, or you're talking about like a bunny hop?
Not quite a bunny hop, short steps, tap, tap. Because I don't have to tell you that, you're a sprint coach. The key to it is the pressure you can exert onto the ground using your legs and your feet. And if you can do more of these in the early part of the race and then move on to a sprint, it could be a lot better. I never got around to it.
I think the encouragement these days is towards triple extension, first movement off the blocks,
Yep.
and thereafter. And as they say, it's not who wins the race to 30, it's decided at 100. So, the acceleration is lasting quite long now. Some of the guys are not reaching maximum velocity till about 70 metres, and so therefore if they hold it for another 10 metres, which is about as long as anyone can hold it, I believe, then there's only about 20 metres to decelerate, and the race is done.
I don't know what they do with breathing now, but breathing was the most a very important part of that, but not inhaling, exhaling, and that I also concentrated on. That when you got to 60, 70, 80 yards, you exhale completely. And if anyone wants to try it out and you want to learn about breathing, all you have to, like people with asthma, I've got one of my children has asthma, and I've always said to her, exhale. Because what asthmatics do and athletes do is they inhale, and inhale causes tension. But exhalation causes relaxation. It's part of what people do in meditation, exhaling rather than inhaling. And this I learned from Andy Stanfield. He was one of my good dear friends and coaches and mentors. Andy, by the way, I should mention this. After I'd beaten him, he gave me an AAU All-American badge, which I had my dear mother sew on to a singlet for me, and I used to run with that. And when I got to Vancouver, the Trinidad and Tobago Commonwealth Games and Olympic Association, they said, man, here's a strip of Trinidad and Tobago. And they gave me a little piece of cloth with Trinidad and Tobago sewn onto it. They said, get one of your girlfriends to sew it on your singlet. And I said, to hell with that. And I ran the Empire Games wearing an AAU All-American singlet.
Michael, 4 years later, you bobbed up at the Cardiff Commonwealth Games representing Canada. And it wasn't... How did that happen?
Well, once again, Trinidad and Tobago have always been pretty lax about how they went about things for their sports people. And not just me, but everybody had the problem. And Trinidad and Tobago said to me that they couldn't guarantee to have enough funds to send a team to Cardiff. And I had been spending a lot of time in Canada, in Vancouver. I spent my summer holidays, my winter holidays in Vancouver. And the head of the Canadian Olympic and Commonwealth Games Association, Harry, Lieutenant Colonel, something, whatever his name was, he said, run for us. And I said, but I don't have citizenship or residency. He said, don't tell anyone, and we won't tell them. So this kind of stuff was going on back then. I was the first West Indian-born sprinter to represent Canada. There was a Guyanese-born middle-distance runner, Phil Edwards, who represented Guyana, and he won 2 or 3 or 4 medals in the 800 and even the 1500. But so I ran for Canada. I won the Canadian Championships, and I ran for Canada, and I got hell from Trinidad for it. And they said, oh, we would have put up the money, and the media carried on. And sometimes most of them are dead now, but sometimes the people still carry on. Man, he ran for Canada. They could give no guarantee, Mike. Let me tell you something about Vancouver. The Trinidad and Tobago Olympic team was going to Vancouver by boat to Montreal and by train across Canada. That's 8 days altogether, possibly 9. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. And my father, he worked for a living, but he was a manager of the local branch of the oil company, and he dug into his pocket and he paid my airfare from Trinidad to Vancouver. And if I hadn't had that, I don't know whether I would have won.
Well, in Cardiff,
in
Cardiff in '58, of course, you had to catch a boat
the
to Cardiff, and that half finished you there.
That's right.
You did get the bronze medal in the 100.
I got the bronze medal, as I said earlier in this discussion, that the only time that Keith Gardner and Tom Robinson ever beat me for that entire summer was in the Commonwealth Games in Cardiff. If I'd had, I can't guarantee it, but I know that I beat them right throughout the summer, because there's nothing like running to make you run fast.
Was there prize money under the table in the period that you competed, and when did that start, to your knowledge, if it did?
It has always been there. Paavo Nurmi, the great Finnish runner, he was rubbed out in 1932, and he was Olympic champion 20, 24, 28 in different events. And Nurmi got rubbed out because the Americans didn't want him to beat their people in 32, and he got rubbed out for having asked for money for running indoors. When I got to the States, I was the perfect amateur. My father, who was a national football, soccer that is, the only football game, my father was national team captain and a devout amateur. The idea of getting paid for anything or anything paid for you other than your transit, your travel, was anathema to him. And when I got to the States, the first meeting I went to was in Boston, and I beat Lindy Remigino and Andy Stanfield running in Harrison Dillard shoes because I didn't have any indoor shoes. And then I went to Washington, D.C., and I set the world record, and I beat Remigino and Bragg. And when we went to Philadelphia, Andy said to me, he said, "Man, how much you making?" He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, man," he said, "you know, I get paid $60 for every race I run," and which was quite a lot of money at that time. And I said, "Oh, I get my room, board, books, tuition, meals, and education, and that's all I get." He said, "Well, man, you better ask for something or I'm going to kick your ass." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I can't get paid if you ain't asking to be paid." It was always there. It's not new. Dan Ferris, who was the quintessential secretary, as they call them today, Secretary General of the American AAU, they were all aware of it. But once again, I think that the idea of amateurism, they wanted to keep it that way. It gave them more control. And Michael, sometimes I wonder whether the amount of money that's being earned has been really beneficial to sports people. It's a moot question.
Well, Usain Bolt earned a lot of money last year.
29 million.
That's what it's said.
Yeah, but probably more.
Well,
who knows?
It's a big number. Yeah. What do you think about who do you think was the greatest or is the greatest sprinter that you've ever seen? And I'm assuming you're recognising Bolt because of his incredible times.
He's an incredible talent and strength, and he's proven it. But I really don't think you can compare sprinters throughout the ages. I wrote this after I'd retired. I wrote it in World Sports saying, you have to take them by the era, the conditions, the circumstances in which they were running. And I think you have to go back to people like Percy Williams, the Canadian, who won the 100 and 200 in 1928 in Amsterdam, as a 19-year-old, also ex-schoolboy. I met Percy in Vancouver in '54. And then you have to look at Eddie Tolan. What a marvelous sprinter he was. And he used to be one of the indoor officials when I was there. Eddie ended up broke. He didn't make any money out of it. Jesse Owens had to run against race horses and trotters and all sorts of handicapped things to feed his wife and daughter. But Jesse Owens until Carl Lewis and now Usain, you have to put Jesse as one of the greats.
Oh, for sure.
But again, Barney Ewell, who didn't get a chance to run, just like Hal Davis, who was another great American, one of the greatest of the white sprinters of the time. Hal Davis from the USC.
10.2, co-holder of the world record at 10.2.
Yeah.
And
Hal was also he ran 20.4 for 220 yards.
And you also had Bullet Bob Hayes.
Bob Hayes. I met Bob out here as well. He was one. It's difficult to compare people in different eras, right? For instance, if you take the name Ray Norton, who was one of the great Americans, I met Ray when he was at San Jose State and I was at Fresno and everyone was touting Ray being great. I beat Ray by 5 yards. But that was I was on the peak and he was still rising. That's a few years before. And the same thing with Harry Jerome. I ran against Harry in the Pan American Games in Chicago in 1959. And the late Lloyd Swindell is one of the great Canadian, he was a coach and he was also a statistician. And he said, "You've got to watch this Jerome kid." And I said, nonsense. Harry didn't even make the finals of the Pan American Games in Chicago. So it's difficult to compare different eras, and you have to find people when they're at their peak.
But Harry Jerome ran 10 flat, and he was the second guy after Armin Hari to run 10 flat.
I ran against Harry. The Germans invited me to Germany in 1958 and again in 1959. I stayed in Leverkusen, which is where Harry worked, with Bayer Leverkusen, the aspirin people, Bayer. And the Americans refused to go and run against Harry or expose themselves to running against him. And I thought, this bugger has got to be cheating at the start. But he wasn't. And I picked that up one evening. We were using one of those little machines that you put 5 pfennig in it and you press a button, and when the coin drops, you press another button. And if I caught it at, let's say, out of 10 or whatever the number was, at 4, 5, or 6, Harry consistently caught it at 2. He just had that start.
Yeah.
And that's what made Harry into what he was. He ended up, I don't know whether he went to jail, but he ended up with a few.
He did 5 months
yeah.
for doing some dodgy land deal or something like that.
Well, Armin came from a working class family, but once he became the Olympic champion, and Germany's only in those events, he began mixing with people who had money and were making money, and there are always dodgy people in that, and he apparently got involved in that. Bob Hayes went to jail for a while.
Addiction. He had an addiction.
Did
Bob
he?
Hayes, yeah.
No, I met Bob out here when he ran against Mike Cleary at Wentworth Park. But, Michael, look, it's going to take a long time for someone to emulate what Usain Bolt has done. And if he goes on to Rio, if the Olympics are going to be on in Rio in 16, and wins both or even one, well, you can put it aside. That's the greatest sprinter of all time. But he's 6'5", isn't he?
Yeah. And how tall are you, Michael? How tall were you?
When I was running, I claimed 5'7", but others said I was 5'6". Now I'm probably about 5'4" as I'm shrinking. But the height. I had the same stride length as Bobby Morrow. And it depends on your ability to move like that. But then you've also got to bring in Dave Sim, or Syme as he's often called. Dave was fantastic. I had run 20.1 at Bakersfield on the West Coast, and Dave had run 20.1 on the East Coast. He was at Duke University. And when we met at Sanger in California in May of 1956, we were the joint world record holders for 220 yards, and I always remember it. We ran the 100, and Dave ran 9.3. I was second in 9.4, which was Jesse Owens' former world record. And I thought, bugger this, I'm going to get this guy. And up came the 200, and we stood at the start, and Dave said, he said, "It's a long way, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, and it gets harder and tougher the further you go." And we took off, and I took off and ran 9.4 for the first 100. And at about 130, I could hear clomp, clomp, clomp. It was Dave coming through. And he ran the world's first 20 flat for 220 yards. That's worth 19.8 on corrected times. And I was second in 20.3, which was Mel Patton. It wasn't Mel Patton, Hal Davis's previous world record. So, once again, sprinters are always ebullient and cocky, and you've got to believe in yourself, and even when you get beaten, you've got to get up and say, "I'm going to get this guy."
Michael, thank you so much for very enlightening experience. Thank you so much. Thank you for coaching me when I was a kid. thank you for giving me my first work as a journalist,
I remember.
starting me on the road
Can I tell that story
to
when
infamy.
when I spoke
No,
to your dad and I said,
Please
I'm
don't.
going to treat him badly and pay him poorly, and your father said, that's fine, he wants to be a journo.
yeah, that's it. So many years later, I'm now retired journo. And thank you for mentoring me
Yeah, my pleasure.
right throughout my journalistic career and my coaching career. That's all, folks.